The dense woods surrounding me were silent. Not the comforting kind of silence you get when you're alone in nature, but the kind that makes the hair on your neck stand up. The trees were thick with tangled branches, and the ground was a mix of wet moss, fallen leaves, and sharp rocks. I had been walking for hours, lost in these woods, but it didn't really matter. I wasn't in a rush. At least that's what I thought. I had come out here to clear my head. The woods were a place I'd come to before, but something felt different this time. It was early in the afternoon when I first started, but as the hours passed, the sun had dipped low enough that I started to feel the weight of the evening creeping in. The trail had long since disappeared, and I was now following nothing but a vague sense of direction. My boots crunched softly against the dirt, the noise echoing in the still air. Every now and then, I'd glance around at the thick trees, the underbrush, and the feeling that someone was watching me. But I told myself I was just imagining things. I was a hiker. I knew these woods. I had hiked through them many times before, but not like this. I paused to take a drink of water from my bottle, staring at the trees around me, the silence wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. I'd been here long enough to know that the forest was never this quiet. There were always sounds, the rustling of leaves, birds chirping, the scurrying of small animals. But this time, nothing, not even the wind. I shook my head, pushing the feeling down. The woods were strange, yes, but I had dealt with strange before. It was probably nothing. I kept walking, trying to find my bearings. The more I walked, though, the more I felt like I was heading deeper and deeper into the unknown. There was no trail, no signs of any human presence, and the trees felt unnaturally close together. It was like the forest was swallowing me whole. I stopped again, looking around. The light was dimming, the shadows growing longer with each passing minute. I needed to find a way out before it got too dark. I'd never been one to panic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had gone too far. The path behind me was no longer visible, and the landscape ahead was just more of the same. Tangled, dense forest with no end in sight. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was beating faster now. Something wasn't right. A rustling sound came from my right, and I froze, my eyes darting in that direction. A low, almost inaudible crunching of leaves. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I strained my ears, trying to listen for more. The rustling stopped, but I could still feel that something was out there. I didn't dare move. Every instinct in me told me to run, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I did, I would only make things worse. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one heavier than the last. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the rustling stopped completely. Not a sound. I waited a moment longer, and then another. Still nothing. I exhaled slowly, my heart racing. Maybe it was just an animal, something harmless. I told myself that over and over as I turned and continued walking. But the unease didn't leave. If anything, it grew stronger. The trees began to look different now. They were darker, more foreboding, their bark twisted in unnatural ways. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the silence was louder than before. I started walking faster, pushing myself harder, hoping to find something familiar, anything to reassure me that I wasn't as lost as I felt. But the deeper I went, the worse it got. I had no idea where I was anymore. The trail was gone, and I was alone, deep in the woods. My legs were starting to ache, and I was getting more and more exhausted. The cold was setting in, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. It was getting darker, and I knew I needed to find shelter, or at least a place to make camp before it was pitch black. I couldn't stay out here without a plan. I spotted a small clearing up ahead, and I moved toward it, my heart lifting a little. Maybe it was a sign of civilization, a way out. But when I reached it, I froze. The clearing was empty, just an open space surrounded by thick trees. There were no signs of any trails, no signs of human activity, just silence. I stepped into the clearing, my boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. As I stood there, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up again. I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched. I quickly scanned the area, my eyes darting to the trees, the ground, the sky, but there was nothing. No movement, no sounds, only the cold silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I couldn't shake the feeling, though. It was like I wasn't alone, like someone was out there, just waiting. I stepped back toward the edge of the clearing, looking around nervously. I needed to keep moving. I needed to get out of here, but then I heard it again. A rustling sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the woods to my right. This time it was closer. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked toward the sound, but saw nothing. The trees were still, the shadows heavy. No movement, nothing that could explain what I had just heard. I started to back away slowly, my feet crunching against the leaves. I didn't want to turn my back on whatever was out there, but I couldn't stay in the clearing any longer. I needed to move. The rustling came again, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. There was no mistaking it. Someone or something was out there. I turned and started walking quickly, my legs moving faster than they had in hours. My mind raced. Who or what was following me? What did they want? I didn't know. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. But the deeper I went into the woods, the more I realized I was still heading in the wrong direction. There were no familiar landmarks, no signs of civilization. Just trees, just shadows. The rustling sound came again. This time so close I could hear the branches breaking underfoot. Whoever or whatever it was right behind me now. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The woods seemed to close in around me, the trees growing tighter, the ground becoming rougher. The darkness was thick now, swallowing everything. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I had to keep moving. I had no choice. Suddenly, I tripped over something large, something solid, and fell to the ground with a crash. I scrambled to my feet, panic surging through me. My hands were shaking as I wiped the dirt from my face, my heart racing faster than ever. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows just ahead of me, a tall, hunched figure. It was watching me, its shape barely visible in the dim light. My blood ran cold and I froze in place. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, its footsteps slow, deliberate. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape, the outline of something tall, too tall for a human, with limbs that looked wrong, twisted. It didn't belong here, and I didn't belong here either. I had to run. I turned and bolted, not daring to look back. The trees rushed past me, the ground uneven beneath my feet. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, faster, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't know how much time had passed or how far I had run, but eventually, I stumbled out of the woods. I found myself at the edge of a small road, the headlights of a passing car blinding me as it sped by. I collapsed onto the shoulder of the road, gasping for air, my body shaking from the adrenaline. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I made it out, and I was never going back. The woods had changed. Something was different out there, something I couldn't explain. I couldn't understand it, but I knew I would never forget it. And I knew deep down that I had been lucky to make it out alive. I don't know what it is about the woods. Something about them always seems to drag me back. Maybe it's the silence, the stillness of it all. Maybe it's the way the trees stand like old, forgotten sentinels, watching over everything and nothing at the same time. Whatever it is, it's something I've always felt comfortable with. I've spent a good portion of my life hiking, camping, and walking through woods like these, the kind that seem to go on forever, the kind where it's easy to get lost if you're not paying attention. Most of the time, I'm fine. I know the dangers, the risks. I know how to keep myself safe. But one hike, one night, changed everything. I was out there alone like I always was. I'd set up camp earlier in the day, had my tent pitched by a small creek that ran through the woods, its water sparkling in the late afternoon sun. The sound of the water was comforting, a kind of constant hum in the background. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that comes with late autumn. I had all my gear with me, a decent meal prepared, and a fire crackling nearby. Everything felt perfect. It was one of those days when you could just feel the peace of being out there, far from the distractions of life, far from everything. There were no other campers around, nothing that would interrupt the quiet. I could feel myself unwinding, the tension from work, from daily life, slowly melting away. It was just me, the woods, and the endless sky above. I don't remember exactly when the feeling started, but I could tell something wasn't quite right. It wasn't the woods. It wasn't anything external. It was more of a tightening in my chest, a pressure that seemed to come out of nowhere. At first, I chalked it up to the altitude. I was higher up in the mountains than usual, and I'd been hiking all day. But as the sun set and the fire crackled, it didn't go away. I tried to ignore it. I was sitting by the fire, eating a quick meal, when I felt my breath start to quicken, like it was harder to get a full inhale. It wasn't painful, not yet at least, but there was something unsettling about it, like something was off. I stood up and walked around the camp a bit, trying to get my mind off it. The cool air felt good against my face, and I took a few deep breaths, but it didn't help. The more I tried to breathe, the more restricted my chest felt, like there was a weight pressing down on me. I sat back down by the fire, trying to focus on the flames, hoping that would help me calm down, but it didn't. My breath kept getting shorter. I felt my throat start to tighten, my chest closing in. It was subtle at first, nothing I couldn't manage. But it wasn't long before I realized something was wrong. I tried to stay calm, told myself it was just the altitude, that I'd been exerting myself all day. Maybe it was anxiety, maybe it was something I ate. But as I sat there, struggling to breathe, a creeping panic started to set in. That's when the thought hit me, what if I can't breathe? What if I'm having an asthma attack or something? I didn't have asthma. At least I didn't think I did. I'd never had trouble breathing before, not even in the most physically demanding situations. But out here alone, it felt like it didn't matter. The pressure in my chest kept growing. It wasn't like a typical shortness of breath. This was different. It was like my lungs couldn't expand properly, like something was squeezing them from the inside. It was hard to take a full breath. I stood up quickly, heart pounding, trying to shake off the panic. The woods around me, usually so calm, now felt suffocating. I could hear the rustling of the leaves in the trees, but it was distant, like I was underwater. My thoughts were scattered. I couldn't focus. I stumbled over to my pack, grabbing for the water bottle, hoping it would help, but the effort felt exhausting. Every time I took a breath, it wasn't enough. The air felt thick. My lungs were desperate for oxygen, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get a full breath. My chest tightened even more. I felt like I was suffocating. The panic started to rise. My vision blurred at the edges. My hands shook as I fumbled with the water bottle, spilling some of it as I tried to drink. I wasn't even thirsty. I just needed something, anything to calm me down. But nothing was working. The pressure on my chest was relentless. It felt like my ribs were closing in on my lungs, crushing them with every breath I tried to take. I stumbled toward my tent, hoping the enclosed space would make me feel safer. But as soon as I stepped inside, I realized how bad it was. I was struggling to breathe even more in there. The air felt heavier. My heart was hammering in my chest, my palms sweating. Couldn't stay still. I couldn't sit down. I paced back and forth, my breath growing more labored with every passing second. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it around the tent, trying to focus on something. But it didn't help. I couldn't get enough air. My breathing was shallow, frantic. I kept trying to take a deep breath, but each one only made things worse. It was like the air was just too thin for me to breathe. I thought I was going to pass out. My chest burned with the effort. Every muscle in my body felt tight, like I was being squeezed from all sides. It didn't make sense. I was healthy. I had been hiking for years. This wasn't supposed to happen. Then I had a thought. What if something was in the air? There were wildfires nearby. I'd heard about them before I left for my trip, but I hadn't expected them to reach this far into the woods. Could it be smoke? Could the air be so thick with it that I was having an allergic reaction? Something I hadn't noticed before? I opened the tent flap and stepped outside, desperate for fresh air. The night was cold, but the crisp air felt different, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The stars were clear overhead, and the woods around me were silent, but the tightness in my chest didn't let up. I could hear my own breath, ragged and shallow, cutting through the night. I dropped to my knees in the dirt, trying to catch my breath, feeling the world start to spin around me. My hands gripped the dirt, my nails scraping against the ground as I fought to stay conscious. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my ears ringing from the lack of oxygen. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. All I could do was focus on trying to draw air into my lungs, but no matter how hard I tried, it wasn't enough. I don't know how long I stayed there, gasping for breath, my body trembling from the effort. Felt like an eternity, but slowly, painfully, the pressure in my chest started to ease. The world around me stopped spinning, and the sounds of the forest started to come back into focus. My breath, though still shallow, became a little easier. My hands stopped shaking. It wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but I could breathe. I didn't know what had happened, but it was over, for now. I don't know what caused it, or why it happened. All I know is that in that moment I thought I was going to die out there, alone, struggling to breathe with no one around to help. The panic that comes with that feeling is something I'll never forget. That inability to breathe, it's a fear that gets deep under your skin. It makes you feel completely powerless, like the world is closing in on you, and there's nothing you can do about it. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed up, staring at the fire, trying to calm my breathing, but I couldn't shake the fear that it might happen again. I didn't sleep much that night. The thought of being out there, alone, and unable to breathe, it haunted me. Eventually, morning came, and I packed up my things, eager to get out of the woods. The hike back down the mountain was slow, each step heavier than the last. I made my way to the trailhead, breathing more easily now, but the feeling of suffocation, stayed with me. I don't know what happened that night, but I know this. That feeling of not being able to breathe is something that never fully goes away. You can't forget it. It reminds you just how fragile you really are. The woods were quiet that morning, too quiet. The kind of silence that makes the hairs on your neck stand up, like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something. I'd been hiking for hours, the sun beating down through the trees, making the ground dry and cracked underfoot. I had been here before, but that didn't stop the isolation from settling in. There's something about being out here, far away from anything resembling a human presence, that gets under your skin. The deeper into the forest I went, the more I felt the weight of it. It wasn't the first time I'd been alone in the woods. Hell, I'd spent most of my life hiking, camping, exploring. I knew the signs of a storm coming, when to turn back, and when to push forward. But I'd never experienced what I did that day. I've always been fairly healthy, never had issues with my lungs, but something about that hike hit me differently. Maybe it was the weather, maybe the air, maybe I had just pushed myself too hard. I had been in the woods for about 3 days, a solo trip I had planned. I didn't mind the isolation, in fact, I kind of enjoyed it. I loved being far from the noise of the city, away from distractions, just the forest, the sounds of nature, and me. That day started out no different from any other. I woke up to the crisp air, made my usual camp breakfast, packed up, and set off along the trail. The first couple hours went fine. I wasn't in any particular rush, just taking my time. The path was well worn, and I knew it was a popular route among hikers, though I hadn't seen anyone else yet. The woods were dense, the trees thick with leaves, casting the ground in a pleasant, dappled shade. The quiet was heavy, but it didn't bother me. I'd heard plenty of hikers say that the silence of the forest could make you uneasy, but I had grown used to it over the years. But after a few more hours, I started to feel it, that slight tightness in my chest. At first, I chalked it up to the altitude, nothing I wasn't used to, but as I moved forward, the sensation worsened. I was breathing heavier, each inhale a bit more strained, and my heart started to race faster than it should have. I stopped for a moment to take a breath and try to shake it off, maybe stretch my legs. I always made sure to stay hydrated, always kept a good pace, but that tightness wouldn't go away. That's when it hit me, really hit me. The panic started in my chest, that feeling of not being able to get enough air. And before I knew what was happening, I was struggling. It wasn't just a tight chest anymore. It was like someone had wrapped a vice around my lungs and was slowly squeezing. Couldn't catch my breath. My chest felt like it was caving in on itself. It was the worst feeling in the world. I dropped to my knees, gasping, desperate to inhale, but the air felt like it was turning to lead in my lungs. Every breath I managed to take was shallow, weak. My fingers gripped at the dirt, and my vision started to blur at the edges, the trees swaying in a way that didn't feel natural. I felt the panic rising in my throat, that desperate, frantic feeling you get when you're sure you're about to die but can't do anything to stop it. I had been in situations before, high winds, bad weather, moments when I thought for sure I was in over my head. But this was something entirely different. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I tried to focus, tried to calm myself down, but the harder I tried to breathe, the worse it got. It was like there wasn't enough oxygen in the air for me to survive. My mind started racing. What if I pass out here? What if I can't make it back? The thought of lying there, alone, unable to breathe, was terrifying. It was like I was suffocating from the inside. My throat closed up, and every inhale felt like it was getting cut off before I could fully take it. I forced myself to get to my feet, but it felt like the ground was spinning beneath me, and I could hardly stand. I stumbled, grabbing onto the nearest tree to keep from falling. My hands were shaking, slick with sweat, my breath coming in gasps. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I could hear it in my ears, like a drum beating faster and faster. I thought about turning back, but I didn't know if I could make it. The thought of retracing my steps through the woods while struggling to breathe was more than I could bear. But staying where I was, helpless and alone, was just as terrifying. I had no choice but to keep moving forward, hoping that somehow the feeling would pass. The world around me seemed to close in as I walked, each step a struggle. I kept my focus on the path ahead, trying not to panic, trying to keep moving. But every time I took a step, I felt like I was sinking deeper into the feeling of being unable to breathe. My chest tightened again, and the sensation started to crawl up my throat. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, not from sadness, but from fear. Eventually, I stumbled onto a clearing, and the weight in my chest seemed to loosen slightly. I stopped in the middle of the open space, gasping for breath, hands on my knees. The air felt slightly less oppressive here, but my body still felt like it was fighting against itself. My head swam, and I could barely hold myself up. I looked around, dizzy, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it altitude sickness? Some kind of allergic reaction? I had no idea. All I knew was that it was getting harder to breathe with every passing second. The panic, the fear, it wasn't just the inability to breathe. It was the feeling of not knowing why it was happening, or if it would stop, or if I would make it out of the woods alive. The minutes felt like hours as I stood there, trying to steady my breath, trying to calm my mind. I focused on the trees, the ground beneath me, anything to stop the panic from taking over. I reminded myself to breathe slowly, to keep my heart from racing any faster. Somehow, after what felt like an eternity, I was able to catch my breath, just enough to keep going. But it didn't go away. The tightness, the weight on my chest, was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. I took a slow, shaky step forward, then another. I forced myself to keep moving. The rest of the hike was a blur. I don't even remember how long it took me to make it back to camp. All I remember was that feeling of suffocation, the panic, the sense of impending doom. I don't know how I made it, but I did. When I finally reached the camp, I collapsed, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. I couldn't stop shaking. I felt like I had just come back from the edge, from something I wasn't sure I could survive. I'd been through rough conditions before, but nothing like this. The inability to breathe, it messes with your head in a way nothing else can. It took hours for the feeling to subside, for my chest to loosen, for the panic to fade. But even after that, I couldn't shake the memory of what it had felt like. That weight on my chest, the sense of not being able to breathe. I don't know what caused it, and I don't know if I'll ever know. All I know is that I never want to experience it again. The woods, the isolation, the silence. It can all seem peaceful, even beautiful, but in that moment, it felt like a trap. I wasn't in control anymore, and that's what really got to me. That feeling, that inability to breathe, it's something that stays with you. Something that, no matter how much time passes, you can't shake. It reminds you just how fragile you are, how quickly things can go wrong, and how terrifying it is when you find yourself completely powerless. The camp was set up in the dense bushland of Victoria, Australia, a perfect spot for a Girl Guide competition. The whole area was surrounded by thick trees and undergrowth, with little else for miles except the occasional chirp of crickets and the hum of the wind weaving through the branches. The rest of the campsites were scattered at various points along the hillside, but our troop, the furthest from the rest of the groups, had been situated down a steep hill where we were out of sight of everyone else. There were 8 of us in the tent, preteen girls, all part of the same troop, all there to compete in this camp, which was more than just an outing. This was about testing our skills, surviving together, and proving ourselves capable of handling whatever came our way. Most of the time, it was fun. We set up camp, made our fire, and prepared our meals with whatever we could gather or bring with us. But this night would be different. The evening had started out just like every other night, with all of us giggling and talking in our tent, the smell of campfire smoke lingering in the air. It was one of those nights where you could feel the warmth from the fire in the distance, but the air itself was crisp and cool. We'd been doing well in the competition so far. No one had fallen behind, and there was a sense of pride in the air. Eventually, the time came to turn in. We all slipped into our sleeping bags, exhausted from the day's activities. The sounds of the night, of the bushland surrounding us, were soothing, and soon enough, one by one, we all fell into a deep sleep. Then it started. First, I thought I was dreaming. There was a faint sound, snuffling, like something rooting around in the dirt, followed by what could only be described as heavy breathing, maybe even grunting. It came from just outside the tent, close enough that it felt like it was right next to us. For a moment, I thought it might be one of the girls playing around, but the sound was too strange, too heavy, and too animalistic. I stirred in my sleeping bag, unsure whether I should wake up or stay still. The grunting and snuffling continued, getting louder, more aggressive. It was as if someone was circling the tent. My heart began to beat faster. The sounds were strange, the air outside was thick with tension, and for the first time I began to feel that something wasn't right. The tent suddenly lurched. I felt the shift of weight as it swayed violently to the side. The canvas groaned under the pressure, and someone was shaking it. The sharp crack of the wooden beams rattling made me freeze in fear. What the hell was going on? I lay still, staring at the inside of the tent, not daring to make a sound. Then it happened again. The tent moved, and the shakes grew more intense. The noise was deafening now. The beams that held the tent upright creaked and groaned with each push, like they were about to snap. I heard one of the girls whimper softly in the darkness. "Shh, quiet," I whispered, but my voice was drowned out by the terrifying sound of whatever was outside. The snuffling grew louder, and now I could hear something scraping against the fabric, the sound of claws or paws on the canvas. My stomach twisted in knots. What was it? A bear? A wild dog? There were 100 things it could be in this remote area, and none of them felt good. I could feel the cold sweat starting to form on the back of my neck. I held my breath, trying to hear through the thick tent walls. My eyes darted around, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then, the tent shook again, this time more violently. The beam holding up the center of the tent creaked like it was about to splinter. The noise outside grew louder, more frantic. Grunting and snuffling turned to heavy footsteps. Whatever it was big, really big. One of the girls, terrified, whispered, "What's happening?" Before I could respond, the beam above me cracked. A sharp sound echoed through the night, and the whole tent collapsed onto us, the weight of the fabric and wooden poles pressing down. My heart was in my throat. I tried to push myself out from under the heavy folds of the tent, but the space was too tight. My mind raced. Was this it? Was something about to break in and drag us out into the night? A loud thud hit the ground outside, followed by frantic screams. "Get up! Get up! Get up!" It was one of the girls. Her voice was frantic, panicked. That's when I knew that whatever was outside, it wasn't just a harmless animal. We scrambled to our feet, the tent now fully collapsed around us. The other girls were already running toward the exit, desperately trying to push their way out of the mess. I was in a daze, half expecting something to jump at us from the shadows. The fear was so thick in the air, I could feel it in my chest. "Where's Sarah?" One of the girls screamed, looking around in the panic. "Sarah?" Another called out, but she was already gone, her footsteps lost in the chaos. It was then that I heard a loud snuffle, almost like a growl, but not quite. The sound was so close that I froze. There, right at the edge of the collapsed tent, was a massive figure, moving in the dark. My breath caught in my throat. The moonlight barely cut through the trees, but I could make out the shadow of something large, low to the ground, and strangely shaped. It was only when the creature moved closer, with a shuffle of leaves underfoot, that I recognized it. A wombat, a huge wombat, the size of a small bear, was standing right outside our tent. Is that a wombat?" I whispered in disbelief, my heart still racing. But there was no time to question it. The beast wasn't backing down. It grunted and snuffled, moving in our direction as if it owned the land. We had unknowingly camped right on top of its prime grazing area, and it was not happy about it. One of the girls screamed again as she turned and stumbled over the ground, tripping over the very creature we were so terrified of. It squealed and turned its massive body toward her, the sound of its claws scraping the earth. "Sarah!" I yelled, seeing her in the moonlight. She was crying, her hands shaking as she tried to get back up. The other girls were already running, sprinting toward the mother house, where the rest of the camp was situated. I could see them disappearing into the shadows, their figures silhouetted by the dim light from the campfire in the distance. I was frozen, unsure of what to do. The wombat didn't seem to care about us at all. It snuffled again, and I could hear the low growl as it ambled away, clearly upset that we were there. I watched in stunned silence as the creature shuffled back into the underbrush, moving slowly but steadily. It didn't seem aggressive now, just more annoyed, like it had been disturbed by our presence. As I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, I realized that the other girls had already made it to the safety of the mother house. We weren't dead, but for a split second there, I really thought we were. The thought of being killed by a wombat seemed so absurd, but in the chaos, in that terrifying moment of not knowing what was outside, it felt real. By the time we finally made our way to the mother house, the rest of the camp was awake, lights on, people looking around to see what had happened. We were all shaken, our hearts still racing in our chests. In the end, it wasn't anything monstrous or supernatural. It was just a family of wombats upset that we'd set up camp on their turf. It wasn't the most glamorous way to get woken up, but in the end, we were safe and the only damage was to our nerves. That night, we learned a lesson in the wilderness. Not everything that frightens you is something to be terrified of. Sometimes it's just the land reclaiming what's rightfully its own. But that was the night I thought I was going to die by a wombat. It wasn't graceful or heroic, just a little too close for comfort. The next day, we packed up camp and moved a little farther down the hill, far away from wombat territory. But even now, years later, I can still hear that snuffling, feel the weight of that terrifying moment when I thought the end was near, and I'll never look at wombats the same way again. I used to take long walks at night, not for exercise, not to clear my head, but because I needed to get away. The place I lived in wasn't exactly bustling with people. It was rural, so rural that even in the daytime you'd have trouble finding someone, and at night, forget it. It was me, the woods, and the quiet. A lot of people might find that peaceful, but for me, it just felt like an escape. I had a drug issue back then, It's not something I'm proud of, but it's the truth. I don't like to think about it much, but sometimes it creeps up in my mind, especially when I remember those walks. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I didn't want trouble. I just needed somewhere to use my drugs where no one would judge me or care, somewhere no one would notice. So the night was perfect. The woods around my dad's house, the empty streets, the quiet. I would wander around aimlessly, high as hell, getting lost in my thoughts, my head spinning with the weirdest shit, feeling like I was a million miles away from everything. It wasn't safe, I know that now, but back then I was too deep in my addiction to care. It didn't matter if it was dark, didn't matter if I was somewhere I didn't know. I didn't even always know where I was going, just that I needed to keep moving. The cold air would sometimes snap me out of my daze, the sharpness of the night biting into my skin, reminding me that I was still there, still alive. But I'd shake it off and keep walking. I didn't want to be reminded of the reality. I wanted to stay numb, to stay out there in the quiet, in the dark. Sometimes I'd make it to the woods, a familiar stretch of trees where I could disappear for hours. Other times, I'd end up on a street, miles from where I'd started. No idea how I'd gotten there or why I'd even walked that far, but I never cared. I'd find a quiet spot, somewhere no one could see me, and I'd do what I came to do. I'd fire up, get lost in the high, and forget everything. For a little while, it felt like I wasn't me anymore, like I could just fade into the night, be part of the darkness, just another shadow moving through the trees. The thing was, though, I wasn't alone out there. I mean, I thought I was most of the time, but there were people around, in the shadows, in the places I couldn't see. Neighbors, houses just out of sight. People who lived their lives in the same rural area, just a stone's throw away from where I'd wander. I never meant to bother anyone. I just didn't want to be seen. The last thing I needed was someone calling the cops, or worse, someone taking matters into their own hands. One night, it was colder than usual, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache, even if you're bundled up. But I didn't care. I was high, and that's all that mattered. I had walked for miles, though I had no idea where I was. The woods were getting denser, and I didn't recognize the landmarks anymore. I could have been lost, or I could have been exactly where I meant to be. Either way, I didn't care. I found myself walking along a dirt road, surrounded by thick trees on either side, the path barely visible under the layer of fallen leaves and twigs. My mind was drifting, thoughts floating like clouds. But then, I noticed something, a mailbox. It wasn't just any mailbox, though. This one was oddly familiar. The red flag was up, the numbers were the same, and I recognized the nameplate on the side. It was my dad's neighbor's mailbox. I didn't really register it at first. My mind was all over the place, jumping from one thought to the next, but then it hit me. I was standing at the edge of his driveway, in the dark, in the middle of the night, high as hell, and I had no idea what I was doing there. I didn't want to be caught. I didn't want to be noticed. But there I was, just standing there, staring at the mailbox like it was the most interesting thing in the world. I shifted uncomfortably, the reality of the situation slowly creeping into my foggy mind. If he saw me, if he came out, I knew what would happen. He wouldn't understand. Hell, no one would. They'd call the cops, or worse. I couldn't deal with that. Not then, not in that state. I did my best to keep my cool, to pretend I wasn't standing there, like I wasn't doing something that would get me into trouble if anyone saw. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the street was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I always did when I was in a place like this, where people lived just out of sight. In the dark, behind closed doors, they were there, but I couldn't see them. It was the worst feeling, knowing someone might be just beyond the reach of the light, just watching. But then it happened. I heard the door to the neighbor's house creak open. My heart leapt in my chest. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The sound of footsteps, slow but deliberate, echoed in the quiet night. It was too late to hide, too late to move. He was coming outside. I don't know why, but my instinct kicked in. I couldn't stay there. I had to leave, and I had to leave now. I backed away from the mailbox, careful not to make a sound, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I turned, taking a step back, then another. I wasn't running, but I wasn't walking either. I was trying to make myself invisible, to blend into the night. My heart was racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear him moving around, probably trying to figure out what I was doing out there. Couldn't be caught. Couldn't let him see me. I kept backing away, step by step, until I was far enough down the road to duck behind a large tree, out of view. I didn't dare move for a while, even after I stopped hearing the footsteps. I stayed crouched there, my body tense, my mind spinning. What would I say if he came looking for me? What could I say? There was no way I could explain myself. There was no way anyone would understand. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the door close again, the footsteps retreating. I waited a few more minutes, listening for any sign that he might come back outside. But the woods were still again silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and stood up slowly. My legs were stiff, my body cold, but I knew I had to keep moving. I had to get out of there before anything else happened. I didn't want to be near that mailbox anymore. I didn't want to be anywhere near that house. I turned and walked away, deliberately slow, trying not to panic, trying to regain some sense of control. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened. I had been in situations like this before, walking around high, feeling like I was invisible but knowing deep down that I wasn't. It was a dangerous game I was playing, but I couldn't stop. I wasn't ready to face the truth about what I was doing to myself, to my life. So, I kept walking, kept drifting through the night, hoping no one would notice, hoping I wouldn't accidentally stumble into something that would get me caught. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was always one step away from disaster, one wrong move away from everything falling apart. And deep down, I knew that eventually, my luck would run out. Sooner or later, I was going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and someone would finally decide to stop me. I was in the woods again, deep in them, further than I should have gone. But that's the thing about hiking alone in places like this, you end up going farther than you expected, farther than you planned. The trail I was following wasn't even a trail anymore, just a memory of one. It was overgrown, with patches where the vegetation grew thick enough to hide the remnants of an old path that had once been a railway line. There were no signs of life, just silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. It was early spring, but the chill of winter still lingered in the air. There was still snow at the higher elevations, and the ground was soft with the thawing frost. The woods smelled of damp earth, pine, and the fresh burst of life that spring brings. But there was something else, a heaviness in the air, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I had been hiking for hours, moving steadily along the winding path, watching the landscape shift from thick woods to more open, rocky ground, before once again being swallowed by dense trees. Felt like a labyrinth. Every time I thought I was nearing a clearing or a hilltop that would give me a view, the trail would dip back into a hollow, and the trees would close in again. The solitude, the isolation was starting to get to me. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy the quiet of nature. I did, but after a while it began to feel like the quiet was too thick, like it was pressing down on me. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I knew I had to make camp soon. I was hoping to find a clearing or something that looked like it might be a good place to set up. But the forest didn't seem to want to cooperate. Every direction I looked, I saw nothing but trees. No open areas, no signs of any previous campers or hikers. That's when I noticed something odd. The trees ahead of me were standing in a strange way. It wasn't immediately obvious, but as I walked closer, it became clear. The trunks of the trees were leaning at odd angles, some of them twisted and bent unnaturally, like they had been shaped by some external force. It was eerie, like something was deliberately distorting the natural order of the forest. I stopped for a moment trying to make sense of it. The wind was calm, and the stillness of the woods only made the sight more unsettling. I thought about turning around, but I had come so far. And besides, the day was fading fast, and I didn't want to waste more time retracing my steps. So I pushed forward, deeper into the woods. The ground beneath my feet was softer now, the snow more patchy, and the air was growing colder. It didn't take long before I found what I was looking for. A small, half-cleared area with a few large rocks scattered around it, perfect for a fire. There was also a small stream nearby, its gentle babbling a welcome sound compared to the quiet that had been pressing in on me for hours. I set up my tent and gathered firewood, moving through the process automatically, though my mind kept returning to the strange tree formations I had passed earlier. I lit the fire and sat by it for a while, watching the flames dance. The warmth was a comfort, and for a few moments, I allowed myself to relax. I ate a simple meal, my thoughts wandering aimlessly. But as night fell and the darkness began to deepen around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I know it sounds ridiculous. It was just the woods, the same as any other. But there was something about this place, something that made me feel like I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see something move in the shadows. The trees, so still during the day, now seemed to loom over me like silent, watching sentinels. Night deepened, and the forest grew quiet, almost unnaturally so. The usual sounds of the night, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, had all stopped. There was nothing but the crackling of my fire. It wasn't until I heard the first movement that I froze. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. But the sound came again, this time louder and closer. My heart started to pound in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and flicked it on, scanning the area around my camp. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, bouncing off the trees, the rocks, the ground, but there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, an animal, a branch shifting in the breeze. But my mind wasn't having it. The noise came again. Closer. The steps were slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet but wasn't succeeding. I stood up, my flashlight in one hand, my knife in the other. My breathing was shallow, my body tense, as if it knew something my mind didn't want to accept. The footsteps stopped just at the edge of the camp, beyond the reach of my light. I waited, hoping the sound would stop, hoping that whatever was out there would just leave. But it didn't. The footsteps resumed, moving slowly around the perimeter of my camp. There was no way I was imagining this. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs. Someone, or something, was out there, circling me. I wanted to call out, to demand whoever it was to show themselves, but something stopped me. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the realization that I had no idea who or what was out there. And that thought alone kept me from making a sound. I had no idea what was lurking in the darkness. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The footsteps continued their slow, methodical circuit around my camp. I gripped my knife tighter, my knuckles turning white. My pulse was thundering in my ears, and my mind raced with possibilities. Was it a person? A hunter? Poacher? Or was it something else entirely? I strained my ears, listening for any clue, any hint of what was happening. But the forest was eerily silent. The only sound, the occasional step in the underbrush. My flashlight's beam was still cutting through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. The silence was absolute. I waited, my breath caught in my throat. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I stood there, completely still, afraid to make any noise, afraid that if I moved, whatever was out there would hear me. The silence stretched on for so long that I started to think that whatever it was had left. Maybe it had just been a deer or a bear or some other animal. But as I relaxed just a little, trying to convince myself I was overreacting, I heard something that froze me in place. A voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but it was there. A low, guttural sound, like a growl or a murmur, came from somewhere to my right, deep in the trees. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my body go rigid with fear. The voice was so close, so human-like, yet not. I didn't move. I didn't dare. My mind was racing, and my heart was pounding. What was this? Was it a person? Or was it something else? What the hell was going on? Then, I heard another sound. Something heavy crashing through the underbrush, moving away from my camp, deeper into the woods. The sound was loud, violent, like whatever it was had finally moved on. But I didn't move. I just stood there, in the cold, in the dark, too scared to make a sound. It wasn't until dawn broke and the light began to filter through the trees that I finally let myself breathe. I didn't go looking for answers. I didn't pack up and try to follow whatever had been out there. I just packed my things quietly, as quickly as I could, and left the camp behind. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest road and flagged down a car, desperate to get back to civilization. I don't know what it was that I encountered in those woods. I don't know if it was a person or something else. I don't know why it was following me or what it wanted. But I know one thing for sure: I never want to find out. It was the beginning of autumn when I decided to take a solo hike deep into the woods. I had been planning it for months, and finally, with the weather cool but not yet biting, I packed up my gear, loaded my truck, and headed out to a trail that promised isolation and serenity. I had done solo trips before, so I was no stranger to the woods, but this one felt different. The kind of different that you can't explain, but you feel it in your gut. The trail was old, a path from days gone by, mostly forgotten by anyone who didn't have a reason to seek it out. It used to be a logging trail, winding through dense pines and moss-covered rocks, following the twists of a stream that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. No one else seemed to be there, just me, alone in the quiet of the forest. The first day passed easily. The woods were quiet, peaceful, and I could feel the stress of the real world melting away. My pack was light, the weather was perfect, and I felt more at ease than I had in months. I made camp near a small creek that ran through a thicket of ferns, the sound of the water rushing over rocks providing a soothing backdrop to my thoughts. I spent the evening setting up my tent, gathering firewood, and cooking some simple food. The crackle of the fire and the soft hum of the evening breeze were the only sounds. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and I crawled into my sleeping bag, feeling the cool air settle in around me. The darkness outside the tent was absolute, but I was used to it. The woods had always been darker than the city, but that was part of the allure. Still, as I lay there, something about the night felt off. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what, but it was that uneasy feeling, like the quiet was just a little too quiet. I tried to shake it off and closed my eyes, the warmth of my sleeping bag helping me drift off into a light sleep. Around midnight, I woke up. It wasn't anything dramatic. No loud noises, no sudden movement. I just woke up, wide awake for no reason I could understand. For a moment, I lay there in the dark, listening. The fire had long since burned out, and all that was left was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But something felt different. There was a subtle tension in the air, as though the woods were holding their breath. I dismissed it as just my imagination playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a sudden fear, more like a creeping discomfort that crawled up my spine. I listened again, trying to focus on the sounds around me. First, all I could hear was the wind. But then, faintly, there was a sound. A crunching of leaves, the snap of a twig. It was distant at first, so I thought it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or something. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing to worry about, but as the minutes passed, the sounds didn't stop. They got closer, slow but steady, and I couldn't ignore the fact that they sounded deliberate, like someone was walking carefully, trying not to make noise but still failing. I tried to calm myself. Could still be an animal, maybe a bear or some other large creature. But the longer I listened, the more it felt like I wasn't alone. The sound wasn't moving in the erratic, unpredictable way that an animal would. It was too precise, too methodical. I gripped the handle of my knife, which was always within reach when I camped alone, and lay still, trying to breathe quietly. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Was it just a deer? A bear? The wind? Or was it something else? I wanted to get out of the tent and look, but I was too afraid to move. I couldn't risk making a sound, couldn't risk drawing attention to myself. So I lay there, frozen, my mind racing with possibilities. Every little sound in the woods seemed magnified. The crackle of leaves, the occasional rustle of branches. It all felt like it was amplified, echoing in my head. Minutes passed, and nothing changed. Then, just as I thought I might be able to convince myself it was nothing, the footsteps resumed. This time they were closer, much closer. My pulse quickened, and I felt my heart start to pound in my chest. I tried to control my breathing to keep my body as still as possible, but it was difficult. Every part of me wanted to run, to get out of there, but I knew that if I made a sound or even moved too suddenly, I could be putting myself in danger. The footsteps circled around the tent, slowly, methodically. I felt like I was being hunted. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do. If this was someone trying to get into my tent, I needed to be ready. I could feel the weight of my knife in my hand, my grip tightening around it. But the footsteps didn't get any closer. They just circled the tent, never getting close enough to make a move. They were just there, lurking, watching, waiting. I don't know how much time passed. Felt like hours, but it was probably just minutes. I tried to steady my breath, tried to keep my mind clear, but all I could think of was the fact that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond the fabric of my tent, watching me. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. I waited, still as a statue, listening. My heart was pounding in my ears, my palms sweaty. The silence stretched on, longer than I could handle. I was about to make a move, to reach for the zipper of my tent, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. It wasn't loud or clear, but it was there, a low murmur, just outside the tent. It wasn't a language I understood, just a soft, guttural sound, like a whisper or a hum. It made my skin crawl. My grip on the knife tightened to the point of pain. I was completely paralyzed, unable to move, unable to think clearly. I had to do something, anything, but I didn't know what. The voice stopped, but the footsteps began again. This time they were moving away, but not in the direction I expected. They were moving further into the woods, deeper into the darkness. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Whoever or whatever it was had moved on. Still, I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept my knife close, my ear to the ground, listening for any further movement. But there was nothing. The woods were silent again. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up my camp quickly, moving with a speed and urgency I'd never felt before. I didn't bother with breakfast or making coffee. I just needed to get out of there. The woods, which had seemed peaceful and tranquil when I arrived, now felt suffocating and dangerous. I packed my gear, threw on my backpack, and began hiking back down the trail, keeping an eye on the shadows between the trees, expecting to see someone or something lurking just beyond my line of sight. Every sound made me jump. Every rustle of leaves felt like a threat. As I made my way back to the main trail, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The ground around my camp was disturbed. There were tracks, human tracks, large and heavy, around the perimeter of my tent. They were fresh, just like the footsteps I had heard the night before. I don't know who or what had been out there, but I wasn't about to find out. I left the woods that day, leaving behind the campsite, the trail, and whatever had been lurking in the dark. I didn't go back for my pictures or my gear. I just wanted out. I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, and I never went back into those woods. Not once. I don't know who or what was out there with me that night. I don't know if it was a person or something else, but whatever it was watching me. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there in the woods. Maybe it was a squatter. Maybe it was someone else lost in the woods. But I don't care to know. I never want to go back to find out. I've learned that some things are better left alone, and some places are better left untouched. I've always loved the woods. There's something peaceful about being alone in nature, away from the noise of cities, away from people. The rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant call of birds, the way the trees stretch upwards as though they are reaching for something beyond this world. It all felt like the right kind of escape. I didn't need anything fancy, just the outdoors, some peace, and my thoughts. It was late fall when I decided to take a trip into the woods. The leaves were starting to turn color, painting the trees in shades of red, yellow, and orange. I had been hiking for hours, following an old trail that had once been used by loggers. The trail was overgrown now, forgotten by most people. It didn't matter to me. The solitude was perfect. I set off with just a small backpack filled with the essentials: water, a bit of food, a first aid kit, and my tent. I didn't think I would need much more. My goal wasn't to push myself too hard on this hike. I wanted to spend a few days in the woods, just wandering and exploring, and then leave when I was ready. The first day passed without incident. I walked for miles, enjoying the crisp air, the sound of my boots crunching over the dry leaves, and the smell of pine and earth. I set up camp in a small clearing, away from any major trails. There was a small stream nearby, its soft babbling adding to the serenity of the place. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I built a fire and cooked up some simple food. The flames flickered in the dark, casting long shadows that danced across the trees. That night, I crawled into my tent, tired from the day's hike. The air outside was cool, but inside the tent, it was warm and comforting. I felt safe. After a while, I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the quiet of the woods. I woke up sometime in the night, though I wasn't sure what had stirred me. Maybe it was the sound of a branch snapping, maybe the wind had picked up, or maybe it was just a dream. Either way, I was wide awake. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness of the tent, the shape of my gear and the fire pit outside barely visible in the faint glow of the stars. For a moment, everything felt still. Then I heard something: footsteps, soft at first, just the faintest crunch of leaves. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, straining to listen. It wasn't an animal. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Human. The footsteps moved closer, just outside my tent. I froze. I had no idea who would be out here at this hour, let alone why someone would be so close to my camp. I didn't make a sound, hoping the person would move on. But they didn't. Instead, the footsteps circled around the tent, moving slowly, as if the person was inspecting it, trying to figure out what I was doing there. My heart thudded in my chest, my mind racing with possibilities. I reached for my knife. I didn't know who this was or what they wanted, but I wasn't going to just sit there and wait for someone to break into my tent. I gripped the handle tightly, my fingers slick with sweat. The footsteps continued, circling the tent with slow, deliberate steps. Whoever it was, they didn't sound like they were in a hurry. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. I didn't dare move. My breath was shallow, my hand still clutching the knife. The silence stretched on, but I didn't hear anything more. No movement, no breathing, nothing. It was like the person had just vanished. I stayed still for a long time, listening carefully for any sign of life, but the only sound I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. When I finally felt sure enough to move, I slowly reached for the zipper of the tent. I pulled it open just a crack, peeking outside. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints in the dirt, no movement, no noise. It was completely still, like the woods had swallowed the intruder whole. I was torn. Part of me wanted to get up and leave, to pack up my things and run out of the woods as fast as I could. But another part of me told me it was probably just some other hiker who had gotten lost in the dark, or maybe even someone passing through. The more I thought about it, the less I wanted to jump to conclusions. Maybe I was just being paranoid. It wasn't like this was the first time I'd camped alone in the woods. I decided to stay the night. After all, nothing had happened. I couldn't let a few footsteps ruin my experience in the woods. But I didn't sleep well after that. Every noise, every rustle of the leaves, made my heart race. The shadows outside seemed darker, more menacing. I kept hearing those footsteps in my mind, imagining them coming closer again, circling my tent. But nothing came. Morning finally arrived, and I was relieved to see the sun rising over the trees. The light had a way of making everything feel safe again. I packed up my camp, trying to shake off the unease I'd felt the night before. The woods were quiet now, peaceful again. I was foolish to let my mind run wild. Still, I couldn't help but wonder, who had been out there? I didn't think much about it the next day, pushing myself to keep moving along the trail. I passed through dense forest, hiked along small streams, and navigated narrow paths that seemed to wind in every direction. It was one of those hikes where you lose track of time, lost in the rhythm of the trail, the gentle incline, the soft earth beneath your feet. But as the sun began to set again, I realized something strange. I was sure I had passed this spot before. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. The trees, the rocks, the way the trail curved to the left. It all seemed so familiar. My stomach dropped. I had been here before hours ago when I was setting up camp. Somehow, I had ended up back at the same place. It was like the forest itself had changed, like it was playing tricks on me. The trees, which had once seemed comforting, now loomed overhead like dark sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled. The trail, which had once seemed so clear, now appeared to be swallowed up by the woods. I retraced my steps, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. But the more I walked, the more lost I became. The sun was nearly gone, the shadows stretching long across the ground. My pace quickened as I looked for a landmark, anything that could tell me where I was. But all I could see were trees that seemed to close in around me the longer I walked. As panic began to set in, I started running. My breath came in gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was just moving, trying to get out of this maze of trees, trying to find something that would give me a sense of direction. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small clearing, the same one where I had set up camp the night before. The fire pit was still there, the ashes cold and dark. But there was no sign of my tent. There was no sign of my gear. It was as if I had never been there at all. I stood there, frozen. Something wasn't right. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves, making the trees creak. I scanned the clearing, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next, but there was no movement. No one. Just me, alone in the woods. I slowly backed away, retracing my steps back to the trail. It took me hours to find my way out of the woods, hours spent in a haze of confusion, each step taking me further from the place I had once known. Finally, I emerged onto a road, and after a long walk, I managed to flag down a car. The driver gave me a ride to the nearest town, where I found a hotel to stay the night. When I think back on it now, I can't explain what happened. Maybe I was disoriented. Maybe the woods just played tricks on my mind. But there's one thing I know for sure. When I was out there, I wasn't alone. Someone or something had been watching me. I can't shake the feeling that the footsteps I heard that night, the ones that circled my tent, weren't just in my mind. There was someone else out there, moving through the woods, just beyond the edge of the firelight. And when I finally left, they were still there, waiting.